All right, guys, in this lesson, we're going to talk about muscle physiology and how it works at a microscopic level. So before we get started, we have to understand this concept of motor units. What a motor unit is that you can have one particular nerve cell that comes in and innervates a specific number of muscle cells. So you can have like maybe 2 muscle cells that it's innervating, or you can even have up to like 2,000 muscle cells that it innervates. So you have all these muscle cells here. So if you look at this image here, here's a good example. So you get this nerve coming in, and it's actually innervating at all these specific different types or different areas of these muscle fibers. Now, just because that one thing happens, what you are getting is one specific motor unit. We're looking at different types of muscle contractions. We have 2 that we're going to compare. You have an isotonic, and then you have something called an isometric. Now, the difference between an isotonic and an isometric is that, first off, we're looking at shape. So if there's another lesson that talks about this specifically, but when you have muscle fibers that are going to shorten, what happens is they move towards the center of the cell, which is right here. So that means that the length is actually going to get shorter and the diameter is going to get wider. So here, if you look at this bicep muscle, every time the muscle contracts, it actually gets shorter, but at the same time, it'll actually get wider. The other thing about isotonic contractions is that the work requires movement. So here we're looking at the articulation of the elbow as the forearm moves up and down. You're actually getting this movement, and so you have this free end. So imagine that this person here has a dumbbell, and every time they lift it, the dumbbell is moving, and so it's got a free end. When you're looking at isometric contractions, they're quite the opposite. So the muscles aren't going to shorten, or they're going to change shape. So you'll still get the contraction that happens, but there's no movement that's actually occurring. This is really important for things like stability, rigidity, maintenance of posture. So if you look at this person, they're doing a plank, you're actually going to get the shortening and the contraction of like the abdominal muscles, the erector muscles in the back. You're going to get some contraction to the glutes and the quads. But all of these are for stability and rigidity, and it's helping to create that core support here. Another important thing to think about are the phases of contraction. So when we look about the phases of contraction, we also look at like the action potential. So we have 4 different ones. We've got latent, which is resting. You've got depolarization, and that's where contraction actually happens. You've got relaxation, which is a repolarization, and then you've got the refractory period, and we're going to go through each one of these. But when we're talking about latent, the latent phase of contraction, we're talking about there's a weak stimulus, and so no contraction is going to happen. The important thing here too is when we're talking about the action potential, there's a certain threshold that has to be met by the action potential. And if it doesn't pass this threshold, no stimulus is going to occur. So this is where we talk about a weak stimulus. When we move along to depolarization, where the contraction phase is, which is right here, basically we hit this threshold and the depolarization happens, and there's a strong enough stimulus to initiate the contraction. Once we get full contraction, what's going to happen is that you're going to have the relaxation and the repolarization. So you're going to have the calcium that leaves the cell. So the calcium's in the cell doing its job, working with the myosin and the actin to create those shortening of the sarcomeres. There's an excellent lesson on that. I encourage you to check that out, see how calcium plays into all of that. But when calcium leaves the cell, the muscle is going to begin to relax, and you're going to get this repolarization here. Now, the refractory period is really important, because what's going to happen is you're actually going to hit this bottoming out. And what happens is there's no new stimulus that's going to override this. So even if you have all cylinders firing in terms of your nerve stimulus, it's just not going to happen. And it's not going to happen until you get back to this resting state and the latent phase. So we have several different concepts of muscle stimulus. And so the first one we're going to talk about is simple summation. So basically you've got that threshold stimulus that I talked about in the previous slide, where basically it's the lowest stimulus that can cause a reaction. So if we don't hit that threshold, there's going to be no muscle contraction. But with a simple summation, what happens is you'll get a contraction, and then before you get complete relaxation, you're going to have another full contraction. So you get these 2 consecutive stimuli. The important thing to know here is that that second stimuli can't happen during that refractory period, but it's gonna but you'll get one you'll get the contraction, then just as you start to rest, you'll get another one. So the idea behind it is called a second twitch, and they're superimposed, and it creates a stronger contraction. So your first twitch is going to overcome 100% of that elastic force, and the second twitch has actually less of resistance to overcome, and you're going to create a much stronger contraction. Tetanus is another type of contraction that you're going to see, and it's basically this idea of multiple rapid stimuli. So what's happening is you get this thing. There are two types that we look at. We've got incomplete tetanus and complete tetanus. And the incomplete tetanus, as it goes along, you're eventually going to hit complete tetanus unless you get this full relaxation. But what happens in incomplete tetanus is you get this constant contraction of these partial relaxations. So you'll start to get the contraction, and then it'll relax just a little, and then you'll get another one, and then another one, and they start to fire in rapid sequence. And then finally you get to the point where the frequency of that stimuli is so great and there's no way for the muscle to react that it ends up basically locking out, and you're going to get this sustained contraction, which is known as complete tetanus. And then there's a concept of fatigue. And so you have the normal twitch. You'll get contraction, relaxation, contraction, relaxation, contraction, relaxation. But at some point, there's not going to be any ATP, and there's going to be no energy for use, and you're going to get this complete fatigue. And what happens is it's just this overstimulation of this muscle. So muscles lose irritability, they lose the conductivity, and they lose the contractility. So if you look here, you'll get kind of the normal contraction, relaxation. You finally get to the point where there's this heat buildup and the residual calcium. And then finally, once you hit to this point where, hey, there's absolutely no way for me to contract this muscle any longer. And you're going to have no ATP here. You're going to have, this is a phase of incomplete fatigue. So basically you're really weak, and then you've got complete fatigue. There are a couple of things to think about though. So number one, you've got in real life, because there's constant circulation and removal of waste. So you have all these waste products that build up and these fatigue substances. What happens is you're going to get the circulation comes in and it removes the waste, and then it also brings in new ATP, and it also brings in new calcium, and it brings in new ways for these muscles to happen. So in real life, it's not a possibility, but it's part of the theory of fatigue. Now, the other thing that's really important, and I'll encourage you to check this out in some of the resources that we talk about, fatigue substances. So your energy products essentially get converted to fatigue substances, and what happens is once those fatigue substances build up, that's going to contribute to fatigue. So we had this idea of muscle tonus, and what muscle tonus is you have the spinal cord, so you have the brain here, and you have the spinal cord, and you're going to be sending out constantly signals to the whole body. Because what happens is if you didn't have this idea of muscle tonus, what would happen was you would never have the idea of proprioception, so where you are in space. You would never have the idea that you need to be upright, you need to be sitting down. These are all kind of innate processes that we don't think about, but something that our body immediately does. So the spinal cord is going to constantly send out these continual action potentials to muscles, and it helps keep us upright, right? So we have this slight state of tension in all of our muscles all the time for them to be on the ready to move. So if we know we're going to grab something, our body can automatically reach over and do it. If we feel ourselves start to lean forward, we know that our back muscles can try to pull us back and keep us up in space. Now, there's a couple of different ideas behind this that kind of they go on either spectrum, if you will, of so let's say you have normal tonus here, and then you have increased tonus, and then you have decreased tonus. Well, in increased tonus, basically it's an increase in the action potential. So they're being stimulated and kicked out even more frequently. And this is caused by increased anxiety, fear, or stress. If you are constantly like anxious, or you feel like you have to, your fight or flight response is a little bit more heightened all the time, that's going to increase the overall tonus. Then you have decreased tonus, which happens during sleep. So when we're sleeping, our muscles need to relax as much as possible for repair and restoration. And that's what happens during decreased tonus. Okay, so let's recap. When we're talking about contraction, we're talking about two different types of contraction. You've got isometric and isotonic. With your isometric, this is the one where you have movement and you have a shortening and a change of the muscle, where isotonic doesn't. And isotonic is also responsible for stability. Then you have your different phases of contraction. You get the resting, the depolarization, the repolarization, the refractory. Remember, nothing can happen during the refractory. There's no stimulus that's going to be able to overcome that. When you have summation, you have basically two consecutive stimuli, and it's going to make that overall contraction greater. With tetanus, you've got the multiple stimuli resulting in that sustained contraction. Basically, this is that lockout that we talked about. When you have fatigue, you have this overstimulation of the muscle. You're going to have that decreased irritability, decreased conductivity, and the decreased contractility. And what happens is the muscle is just overwhelmed with the amount of stress, and it's not going to work. Remember, this doesn't happen in real life because we have circulation, which helps in that. But it's an important to understand because muscles do get fatigued, and at some point they do need to rest and relax and restore themselves. But you're never going to get complete fatigue. So that's it for our lesson on muscle physiology. Make sure you check out all the resources attached to this lesson. Now go out and be your best selves today. And as always, happy nursing.